The restaurant was already busy before the evening rush had even begun. Soft lights reflected off polished glass tables, and quiet music played in the background, creating a calm atmosphere that didn't match the pressure behind the scenes. Staff moved quickly but carefully, balancing trays, adjusting plates, and keeping smiles ready for every guest who walked through the doors. She had been on her feet since the afternoon. Like every day, she tied her hair neatly, straightened her uniform, and stepped onto the floor with the same quiet determination. She didn't talk much, not because she couldn't, but because she had learned that silence made the long hours easier. It helped her focus, helped her move through the shift without drawing attention. Most customers barely noticed her beyond placing orders or asking for the bill. A few were kind, offering a small smile or a thank you, but many treated her like part of the background. She didn't take it personally. To her, this job was not about recognition. It was about survival. She had been working there for a long time, long enough to memorize the menu, long enough to understand what kind of guest would be difficult before they even spoke, and long enough to know how to keep things running smoothly no matter how chaotic it got. The restaurant was known for its wealthy customers, and that meant high expectations. Mistakes were not tolerated easily. That evening felt different from the start. There was tension in the air, something unspoken but clear in the way the manager kept checking his watch and calling staff aside for quick instructions. Orders were being rushed, tables rearranged, and extra care was being taken with every detail. She noticed it but didn't ask questions. It wasn't her place. As she carried a tray of drinks to one of the tables, she overheard a conversation between two senior staff members. They were speaking quietly, but their tone made it hard to ignore. "A private event," one of them said. "Last minute. Big client." "How big?" the other asked. "Big enough that everything else comes second tonight." She kept walking, placing the drinks gently in front of the guests, but her mind stayed on those words. Private event meant extra work. It meant longer hours. It also sometimes meant better tips, but that was never guaranteed. A little later, the manager called everyone together for a quick briefing. His voice was firm but controlled. "There's been a change," he said. "We have a private party booking for tonight. It's not happening here. It's at a private residence. A few of you will need to go and assist there." There was a brief silence. Some staff exchanged looks, others seemed curious. Working outside the restaurant wasn't unusual, but last-minute arrangements always came with uncertainty. He began calling out names. When he said hers, she felt a small knot tighten in her stomach. "You'll be part of the team going," he added. "Be ready in 20 minutes. She nodded without saying anything. There was no point in asking questions. She knew how this worked. When she was needed, she went. In the staff room, the mood was mixed. Some were excited, whispering about what kind of place they might be going to. Others complained quietly about the sudden change in plans. She stood near her locker, adjusting her sleeves and checking that everything looked right. One of her coworkers walked over. "Have you ever worked one of these private events before?" they asked. She shook her head. "No. They say it's some millionaire's place," the coworker said, lowering their voice slightly. "Huge parties, expensive everything." She gave a small nod, not reacting much. The idea of stepping into that kind of world felt distant, almost unreal. It wasn't something she spent time thinking about. Within minutes, they were all gathered outside, waiting for transport. A vehicle arrived, and the selected staff climbed in, sitting quietly as the city lights passed by outside the windows. The ride felt longer than it probably was. No one spoke much. Everyone seemed to be thinking about the same thing, even if they didn't say it out loud, what kind of night this would turn into. When they finally arrived, the first thing she noticed was the size of the place. The gates alone were taller than anything she was used to seeing up close. As they opened, revealing a long driveway lined with lights, she felt a quiet sense of disbelief. The house wasn't just large. It was something else entirely. Every detail, from the exterior design to the perfectly maintained surroundings, reflected a level of wealth she had only ever seen from a distance. She stepped out of the vehicle and adjusted her grip on the small bag she carried. For a brief moment, she felt out of place in a way that was hard to describe. It wasn't just about the location. It was the feeling of stepping into a world that didn't belong to her. But she pushed that thought aside quickly. Work was work. Inside, the atmosphere was already alive. Decorations were elegant but not excessive. Music played softly in the background, and a few early guests had already arrived. Everything looked perfectly arranged, yet there was still a sense of urgency among the staff setting up. They were given quick instructions by the event coordinator, who moved quickly from one person to another, making sure everything was in order. "You'll be serving drinks and assisting guests," the coordinator told her. "Stay attentive. Keep things smooth." She nodded again, taking her position without hesitation. As the evening progressed, more guests arrived. The room filled with conversations, laughter, and the quiet clinking of glasses. People dressed in expensive outfits moved confidently through the space, greeting each other as if this was a normal part of their lives. She moved among them carefully, offering drinks, clearing empty glasses, and making sure everything stayed neat. Her movements were calm and practiced, even though her surroundings felt anything but familiar. At one point, as she walked past the center of the room, something caught her attention. A grand piano stood there, placed perfectly under soft lighting. It looked almost like a centerpiece, though no one was using it. People walked past it, barely giving it a glance. She slowed down for just a second. There was something about it that pulled her attention. Not because it was expensive or beautifully designed, but because it felt familiar in a way nothing else in the room did. For a brief moment, the noise around her seemed to fade. Then someone called out for a drink, and she snapped back to reality. She continued working, but every now and then, her eyes drifted back toward the piano. It stood there quietly, untouched, as if waiting for something. She didn't realize how long she had been glancing at it until one of her coworkers nudged her lightly. "Careful," they whispered. "Don't get distracted." She gave a small nod, focusing again on her tasks. The night was still young, and there was a long way to go. Guests continued to arrive, the energy in the room growing stronger with each passing minute. She moved through it all silently, doing her job the way she always did, without drawing attention, without making mistakes. But somewhere in the back of her mind, a quiet feeling had started to grow. A feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. And even though she tried to ignore it, it didn't go away. The room grew louder as the night went on. More guests arrived, bringing with them a different kind of energy. Laughter became stronger, conversations turned more animated, and the music in the background blended into a steady rhythm that filled the space without taking control of it. She kept moving, just like before, carrying trays, refilling glasses, and making sure every table stayed clean and organized. Her steps were careful, her posture straight, and her expression calm. Anyone watching her would think she had done this kind of work her entire life without ever feeling tired. But something had changed. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. Her attention kept drifting back to the same spot in the room, the grand piano. It stood quietly under soft golden light, untouched by the guests who passed around it. Some glanced at it for a moment, maybe appreciating its beauty, but no one stopped. No one sat down. No one even lifted the cover. Felt strange to her. At a party like this, everything had a purpose. Every detail was chosen carefully. Nothing was placed without reason. And yet the piano, something so powerful, so capable of filling the entire space with sound, remained silent. As she walked past it again with a tray of drinks, her pace slowed just slightly. Her eyes moved across its surface, taking in the smooth finish, the clean lines, the way it reflected the lights above. For a moment, her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray. Then she kept walking. A guest called out to her, asking for another drink, and she responded immediately, her voice soft but clear. She handed over the glass with steady hands, offering a polite smile before moving on. She didn't allow herself to linger. Still, the feeling stayed. It followed her through the room as she worked, quiet but constant, like a memory trying to surface. At one point, she found herself near a group of guests who were deep in conversation. Their voices were louder than most, their laughter easy and confident. "This party is great," one of them said, looking around. "But something's missing." "Like what?" another asked. "I don't know, maybe some live music? That would make it perfect." A few of them nodded in agreement. "Yeah, a piano would be nice," someone added, glancing toward the center of the room. "There's one right there." They all looked at it for a moment. "Does anyone here even play?" another asked with a small laugh. The group went quiet for a second, then shrugged it off, returning to their conversation. She stood nearby, listening without meaning to. Her eyes shifted again toward the piano. A quiet thought crossed her mind, but she pushed it away immediately. She moved on, continuing her work. As time passed, the room became even more alive. Glasses clinked together in celebration, conversations overlapped, and the air felt heavier with energy. It was the kind of environment where people forgot about everything outside and focused only on the moment. She stayed focused on her role. But the closer she got to the center of the room, the harder it became to ignore what she felt. At one point, she was asked to clear a table not far from the piano. As she approached, she noticed how close she was this time. Closer than before. She placed the empty glasses on her tray one by one, trying to keep her attention on the task. But then, without thinking, her eyes lifted. The piano was right in front of her now. For a brief second, everything else seemed to fade again. The noise, the movement, the people, it all blurred into the background. What stood in front of her wasn't just an instrument. It felt like something from another part of her life. Her breathing slowed slightly. She could almost remember the feeling of sitting in front of keys like these. The weight of each note. The way sound could fill a room without needing words. A memory tried to form, but she stopped it before it could fully appear. This was not the time. This was not the place. She picked up the last glass and turned away quickly, almost as if she had been caught doing something she shouldn't. As she walked back toward the service area, one of her coworkers noticed her expression. "You okay?" they asked quietly. She nodded. "Yes. You look distracted." "I'm fine," she replied, keeping her voice steady. The coworker didn't push further. There wasn't time for long conversations anyway. Everyone had their own tasks to handle. Still, as she returned to the main floor, the feeling didn't disappear. It grew stronger. Guests continued to talk about music here and there, mentioning how it would improve the atmosphere. Some joked about it, others seemed more serious. Eventually, one guest spoke louder than the rest. "Come on," they said, raising their voice slightly. "There's a piano here and no one is playing it? That's a waste." A few people laughed. "Maybe we should hire someone next time," another replied. "Or maybe someone here can play," the first one added, looking around the room. The idea spread quickly, moving from one group to another. "Does anyone know how to play?" "No idea." "Someone must." The tone was light, playful, not demanding. But it caught attention. Even the host, who had been speaking with a few important guests, turned slightly toward the conversation. A faint smile appeared on his face, as if he found the idea entertaining. "That could be interesting," he said casually. "Live music always changes the mood." People nodded in agreement. "Anyone?" Someone called out again, half joking, half serious. There was no response. A few guests laughed, shaking their heads. "Looks like we're out of luck," one of them said. But then, another voice spoke up. "What about the staff?" they suggested. "Sometimes you find hidden talent where you least expect it." That comment drew a few amused reactions. The idea wasn't taken too seriously at first, but it lingered in the air. Some guests began glancing at the staff members moving around the room, as if trying to imagine one of them sitting at the piano. She felt those glances, even if they weren't directly focused on her. Her steps slowed just slightly. She kept her head down, focusing on her work. But her heart began to beat a little faster. It was an odd feeling. Not fear exactly. Not excitement either. Something in between. She told herself it meant nothing. It was just talk. Just people joking around at a party. Still, she found herself avoiding the center of the room more than before. She stayed closer to the edges, moving between tables, keeping her distance from the piano. But no matter where she went, she could feel it, the presence of it, the possibility of it. At one point, she stepped into a quieter area for a moment, adjusting her tray and taking a small breath. The noise of the party softened slightly there, giving her a brief break from the constant movement. She closed her eyes for just a second, and in that second, a memory finally slipped through. Not clear, not complete, but enough. A younger version of herself, sitting in front of a piano. The sound of music filling a small room. A feeling of peace. Then it was gone. Her eyes opened quickly. She shook her head slightly, as if trying to push the thought away. That life was different. That time was over. She picked up her tray again and stepped back into the main room. The party continued, louder than before, full of life and energy. And yet, beneath it all, something was building. Something quiet. Something waiting. And even though no one had said it directly, the idea had already taken hold. The piano would not stay silent forever. The idea started as a joke, but it didn't fade away like most jokes do. Instead, it stayed in the air, moving from one group to another, growing a little stronger each time someone mentioned it. At first, people laughed about the piano being untouched. Then they started asking questions. Then they began looking around the room with more attention, as if the answer might be standing right in front of them. She felt that shift without anyone needing to say it directly. Her movements stayed the same. Steady, careful, professional. But inside, something had started to tighten. She kept her focus on the trays in her hands, on the tables that needed clearing, on the guests who needed refills. It was easier that way. But the voices around her were getting harder to ignore. "Seriously, no one can play?" a guest said, louder than before. "There must be someone," another replied. "It's too perfect not to use." A small group formed closer to the center of the room, near the piano. Their attention was fixed on it now, no longer just passing by. The soft lighting made it stand out even more, almost inviting someone to sit down and break the silence. The host noticed the growing interest. He stepped forward slightly, holding his glass, his expression calm but curious. "It seems the piano has become the center of attention," he said with a light smile. "That wasn't exactly planned, but I don't mind." A few guests laughed. "Then let someone play," one of them said. "Yes, let's hear something," another added. The host looked around the room, scanning the faces of his guests first, then slowly shifting his gaze toward the staff. "Anyone here willing to give it a try?" he asked. His tone wasn't demanding. It was casual, almost playful, but it carried weight. For a moment, no one responded. Some guests shook their heads, smiling. Others lifted their hands slightly as if to say they didn't know how. The attention began to drift again, just slightly. Then someone spoke up from the crowd. "Ask the staff," they said. "You never know." A few people chuckled, but the suggestion stuck. The host turned his attention fully toward the staff now. His eyes moved across them one by one. Not harshly, not critically, but with interest. She felt that gaze pass over her. Her grip on the tray tightened just a little. She lowered her eyes, focusing on the glasses she was carrying. This wasn't about her. Couldn't be. She told herself that again and again as she stepped away from the center of the room, heading toward a table near the side. Her heart had started to beat faster, though she couldn't explain why. "Can you play?" a guest suddenly asked one of the other servers nearby. The server laughed nervously. "No, I'm afraid not." "What about you?" another guest asked someone else. They shook their head quickly. The questions continued, moving from one staff member to another, light and playful on the surface, but carrying an undercurrent of expectation. She kept moving, trying to stay out of it. But then a voice came from behind her. "What about her?" She froze for a second before turning slowly. A guest was looking directly at her. It wasn't an aggressive look, just curious, but it was enough to make her feel exposed. "She seems quiet," the guest added. "Maybe she's hiding something." A few people laughed softly. She felt the heat rise to her face, but she kept her expression controlled. "I'm sorry," she said politely. "I'm just here to serve." It was a simple answer, the kind that usually ended conversations like this. But this time it didn't. "Come on," another guest said. "Just try. It's all in good fun." "Yes, just a few notes," someone else added. The attention was growing now, more people turning toward her, watching, waiting. She shook her head slightly. "I don't think that's a good idea." Her voice was calm, but there was a hint of hesitation in it. The host stepped a little closer, not too near, but enough to be part of the moment. "No pressure," he said, his tone still relaxed. "But if you can play even a little, it might make the evening more interesting." His words were gentle, but they carried influence. The guests seemed encouraged by his attitude. "Exactly," someone said. "We just want to hear something." She stood there, caught between the tray in her hands and the weight of all those eyes on her. Her mind raced. She hadn't touched a piano in a long time. Not like that. Not in front of people. Not in a room like this. The thought alone made her chest feel tight. "I really don't think I should," she said again, a little more quietly this time. But the requests didn't stop. "Please," one guest said, smiling. "It'll be fun," another added. "Just sit down and try," someone encouraged. The voices blended together, not forceful, but persistent. She looked around, hoping to find a way out of the moment. Maybe someone else would step forward. Maybe the attention would shift. But it didn't. If anything, it became more focused. Her coworker, who had spoken to her earlier, stood a short distance away. Their eyes met for a brief second. There was a look there, uncertain but also encouraging. Not pushing, just understanding. She took a small breath. Her heart was beating louder now, almost in rhythm with the noise of the room. She glanced toward the piano. It stood exactly where it had been all night, unchanged, waiting. The distance between her and it suddenly felt much shorter than before. She knew that if she said no again, eventually people would move on. The moment would pass. Everything would go back to normal. She could continue her shift, finish her work, and leave without anyone remembering this. That would be the safe choice, the easy choice, but something inside her resisted it. A quiet voice, almost buried, told her that this moment mattered, even if she didn't fully understand why. She lowered the tray slowly, placing it on a nearby table. The room seemed to grow quieter, as if everyone sensed what was about to happen. She looked at the host for a brief moment. He didn't say anything this time. He just watched, waiting. She nodded slightly. "Okay," she said softly. The word was barely louder than a whisper, but it was enough. A small wave of excitement moved through the crowd. "Here we go," someone said. She wiped her hands lightly against her apron, a nervous habit she hadn't even realized she still had. Then she took her first step toward the piano. Each step felt heavier than it should have. The room seemed larger now, the distance longer, even though nothing had changed. She could feel every eye on her, every movement, every second. Her thoughts were loud, filled with doubt. What if she made a mistake? What if she couldn't remember? What if she disappointed them? But she kept walking. She reached the piano and stood beside it for a moment. Up close, it looked even more intimidating. The keys were perfectly clean, untouched, almost like they were waiting for the right person. She hesitated, just for a second. Then she slowly sat down. The room fell completely silent. No more laughter, no more conversations, just stillness. She placed her hands in her lap, staring at the keys. Her fingers felt slightly stiff. It had been so long. She closed her eyes briefly, taking a slow breath. In that moment, everything else faded away again. The room, the people, the pressure, all of it disappeared, leaving only her and the piano. She lifted her hands and placed them gently on the keys. For a second, she didn't move. And then, she began. For a brief moment after her fingers touched the keys, nothing happened. The silence stretched just enough to make a few people shift slightly in their place. Some guests leaned forward, curious. Others exchanged quick glances, as if wondering whether this would turn into something awkward. She could feel all of it. The weight of expectation. The quiet doubt in the room. the unspoken thought that maybe this had been a mistake. Her hands rested lightly on the piano, her fingers barely pressing down. They felt colder than usual, a little stiff, as if they didn't fully belong there anymore. But then she took a slow breath, and instead of thinking about the people behind her, she focused only on the keys. She pressed the first note. It was soft, almost too soft, but it was clear. The sound didn't rush out. It settled gently into the room, like something testing the air before fully stepping into it. A few people blinked, their attention sharpening. Then she pressed another note, and another. First it sounded simple, careful, like someone finding their balance after a long time. Her fingers moved slowly, not rushing, not trying to impress, just remembering. The room stayed quiet, but the silence had changed. It was no longer filled with doubt. It was filled with attention. She continued. The notes began to connect, forming a pattern. The hesitation started to fade, replaced by something steadier. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. Her breathing found a rhythm. And then, almost without realizing it, she let go. The music changed. It became fuller, deeper, more confident. Her fingers moved faster now, gliding across the keys with a natural flow that didn't look forced. It was as if something inside her had unlocked. The careful beginning turned into something alive. People who had been standing casually before now stood completely still. Conversations that had paused for a moment didn't return. No one spoke. The sound filled the entire room, reaching every corner, wrapping around every person standing there. It wasn't loud in a harsh way. It was strong, but controlled. Every note felt placed with purpose. Her expression remained calm, but there was something different in it now. A quiet focus, a deep connection to what she was doing. She wasn't looking at the guests. She wasn't thinking about the room. She wasn't even thinking about herself. She was just playing. The music carried emotion in a way that didn't need explanation. It rose and fell, soft in one moment, powerful in the next, like a story unfolding without words. Some guests slowly set their glasses down, almost without noticing. Others took a small step closer, drawn in by something they couldn't quite describe. The host stood near the front, his earlier relaxed expression replaced by something more serious. His eyes stayed fixed on her hands, watching every movement. This was no longer entertainment. This was something else. Her fingers moved with confidence now. No sign of hesitation left. The stiffness from the beginning had disappeared completely. In its place was a natural ease, like she had never stopped playing at all. The music grew stronger again, reaching a peak that filled the room with energy. And then, just as smoothly, it softened. The transition was effortless. It pulled the room in closer, holding everyone in a quiet moment that felt almost fragile. A few guests exchanged glances, but no one spoke. No one wanted to break it. There was a feeling in the air that was hard to explain. Something real. Something honest. She wasn't performing to impress. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was simply expressing something that had been buried for a long time. And everyone could feel it. As the music continued, small details began to stand out. The way her fingers curved perfectly over the keys. The way her posture stayed steady, controlled. The way her head tilted slightly at certain moments, as if she was listening to something deeper than the sound itself. It didn't look like someone who had just been asked to try. It looked like someone who had lived with music for years. The room remained completely silent except for the piano. Even the staff, who had been moving constantly before, had stopped. They stood at the edges, watching just like the guests. Time seemed to slow down. No one checked their phone. No one looked away. The music had taken full control of the moment. As she moved into another part of the piece, the tone shifted again. It became lighter, almost hopeful, like a quiet rise after something heavy. It wasn't dramatic in an obvious way, but it carried a feeling that reached people without needing explanation. One guest let out a small breath they didn't realize they had been holding. Another leaned slightly forward, completely absorbed. The host's expression softened. Though he didn't say anything, the music continued to build. each note flowing into the next with precision and emotion. There were no mistakes, no pauses, no uncertainty. It was seamless. And the longer it went on, the more unbelievable it became for the people watching. This wasn't just talent. It was something deeper, something shaped by time, by experience, by moments no one in that room had seen. She reached the final part without rushing. The music slowed, gently, like it was coming to a natural end rather than being forced to stop. Each note became softer, more delicate. The room seemed to lean in with it. And then, with one final movement, she let the last note fade into silence. Her hands stayed on the keys for a second longer. Then she slowly lifted them. The room didn't react immediately. There was a pause. A real pause. The kind that only happens when people are still processing what they just experienced. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence that followed was even deeper than before. She lowered her hands into her lap, her breathing calm but slightly heavier than before. For a brief moment, she looked down at the keys. Then she stood up slowly. She didn't look at the guests right away. She didn't expect anything. To her, it had only been a moment that had come and gone. But to everyone else in the room, it was something they hadn't expected, something they couldn't ignore. And just as the silence reached its peak, it broke. The silence didn't last long after that final note faded, but it felt like it stretched for several seconds. Then, almost all at once, the room came back to life. Applause filled the space. Not light, polite clapping, the kind people give out of habit, but something louder, fuller, more real, came from every corner of the room. People who had been standing still only moments ago were now clapping with genuine energy, some even stepping closer to the piano without realizing it. She stood there for a second, unsure of what to do. Her hands moved slightly, almost as if she wanted to return to work immediately, to pick up a tray and continue as if nothing had happened. That instinct was strong. It had always been easier to disappear back into her role than to stand in front of attention. But the applause didn't stop. If anything, it grew stronger. A few guests even nodded at her with respect, something she wasn't used to receiving in this setting. Others looked at each other with expressions that said the same thing without words. They had not expected that. She finally lifted her eyes. For the first time since she had started playing, she really looked at the room. Everyone was looking at her. Not in a curious or doubtful way like before, but in a way that felt different. She shifted slightly, unsure how to respond. A small, polite smile appeared on her face, but it carried a hint of discomfort. She wasn't used to being the center of anything. The host stepped forward then, slowly, not rushing the moment. The applause softened as people noticed him moving, but it didn't fully stop. He approached her with a calm, steady expression, his gaze focused but not overwhelming. "That was," he began, then paused for a brief moment, as if searching for the right word. "Unexpected," he finished, though his tone suggested it meant much more than that. The applause faded into a quiet murmur as the guests watched the interaction. She lowered her eyes slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft and respectful. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried weight. For a second, she didn't answer. Not because she didn't want to, but because she wasn't sure how to explain it in a way that made sense in a room like this. "I learned a long time ago," she said finally. Her words were careful, measured. He studied her for a moment, as if trying to understand more than what she was saying. "A long time ago?" he repeated. "That didn't sound like something you learned and forgot." A few guests nearby smiled slightly at that. She gave a small, almost hesitant shake of her head. "I didn't forget," she said. "I just stopped." That answer shifted something in the atmosphere. The curiosity deepened. "Why?" one of the guests asked from behind the host, unable to hold back the question. She glanced briefly in that direction, then looked down again. "Life," she replied simply. It wasn't a long explanation, but it didn't need to be. There was something in the way she said it that made it clear the story behind that one word was not simple. The host seemed to understand that. He didn't press immediately. Instead, he took a small step closer, his tone softening slightly. "You have real skill," he said. "That wasn't just practice. That was something more." She didn't know how to respond to that. Compliments like that didn't fit easily with how she saw herself now. "I just played what I could," she said quietly. "But that's exactly it," he replied. "Most people can't do what you just did, no matter how much they try." The guests around them nodded in agreement. "She's right," one of them added. "That was professional level. Better than some professionals," another said. The comments continued, each one adding to the attention she was already struggling to handle. She shifted her weight slightly, glancing toward the side of the room where the staff usually stood. Part of her wanted to step away, to return to what she knew. But the host wasn't finished. "What made you stop?" he asked again, this time more gently. There was no pressure in his voice now, only curiosity. She hesitated. This wasn't a question she answered often. "I used to practice every day," she said slowly. "For years." Her voice remained calm, but there was a quiet weight behind her words now. "It was important to me." She paused, then continued. "But things changed." She didn't go into details, but the meaning was clear enough. Responsibilities, difficult choices, moments where dreams had to be set aside. The host nodded slightly, as if he understood more than she had said. "And now you're working here," he said, not as a judgment but as an observation. "Yes," she replied. There was no shame in her voice, just honesty. He looked at her for another moment, then glanced briefly at the piano. "You didn't look nervous once you started," he said. She gave a small, almost surprised smile at that. "I was," she admitted. "At the beginning." "It didn't show," he replied. A few guests laughed softly. "That's true," someone said. "She made it look easy." She didn't respond to that. To her, it hadn't felt easy. It had felt like stepping into something she had left behind for too long. The host took a slow breath, then straightened slightly. "Well," he said, his tone shifting just a little, becoming more decisive. "I'm glad you didn't say no." There was a quiet agreement in the room. "So are we," one of the guests added. He looked back at her. "You changed the entire atmosphere tonight," he said. "This party will be remembered because of that moment." She blinked slightly, not expecting that. "I didn't mean to do anything like that," she said. "I know," he replied. "That's what makes it real." For a second, neither of them spoke. The room had grown quieter again, but this time it wasn't out of tension. It was out of interest. People were listening closely now, watching, waiting. He seemed to consider something, his expression thoughtful. Then he spoke again. "Do you still play?" he asked. The question felt simple, but it carried something more beneath it. She looked at the piano briefly, then back at him. "Not really," she said. "Not really," he repeated. "Or not at all?" She hesitated. "Not like before," she admitted. He nodded slowly. "That's a loss," he said. "Not just for you." She didn't answer that. She wasn't sure how to. For a moment, the room stayed still again, as if something important was about to happen, though no one knew exactly what. She stood there, caught between two worlds, the one she had been living in, and the one she had just stepped back into, even if only for a few minutes. And for the first time that night, it felt like those two worlds had finally noticed each other. The room didn't return to the same energy it had before the music. Even though people slowly picked up their conversations again, something had shifted. The laughter was softer now, more thoughtful. Guests still enjoyed themselves, but there was a new kind of awareness in the air. She stepped away from the piano quietly, almost as if she didn't want to disturb the moment she had just created. Her instinct was clear: go back to work, return to the role she understood, and let everything settle on its own. She picked up a tray from the side table and began moving again, offering drinks, clearing glasses, doing everything she had been doing before. But this time it felt different. People noticed her now, not in the usual way. Some guests paused their conversations as she approached, thanking her more warmly than before. A few gave her small nods of respect. Others looked at her with curiosity, as if trying to understand how someone like her could carry something so powerful so quietly. She responded the same way she always did, polite, calm, focused. But inside, things were not as steady. Her mind kept replaying the moment at the piano. Not the applause, not the attention, but the feeling of playing again. The way everything else had disappeared. The way it had felt. Right? She hadn't allowed herself to feel that in a long time. As she moved through the room, she tried to push those thoughts aside. Work still needed to be done. The night wasn't over yet. But then she noticed the host walking toward her again. He wasn't rushing, but his steps were purposeful. She straightened slightly, preparing herself for another conversation. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" he asked. His tone was calm, but there was a seriousness in it now that hadn't been there before. She nodded. "Yes." He gestured toward a quieter corner of the room, away from the main crowd. It wasn't completely private, but it gave them space to talk without interruption. She followed him, her steps steady but careful. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then he turned to face her. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began. "About how you stopped." She listened quietly. "You didn't lose it," he continued. "That's clear. Talent like that doesn't just disappear." She didn't respond right away. "I didn't think it mattered anymore," she said after a moment. "It matters," he replied immediately. "More than you think." She looked down slightly, unsure how to take that. "For some people, maybe," she said. "For you," he corrected. There was no hesitation in his voice. She remained silent, letting his words settle. He took a small breath, then spoke again, more directly this time. "If you had the chance to start again, would you?" The question caught her off guard. She hadn't allowed herself to think about that in a long time. Starting again meant more than just playing. It meant stepping back into something she had left behind, something that had once meant everything to her. "I don't know," she said honestly. He nodded as if he expected that answer. "That's fair," he said. "But sometimes not knowing is just another way of saying you haven't been given the right chance." She looked at him, her expression uncertain. "What do you mean?" she asked. He paused briefly, choosing his words carefully. "I mean," he said, "what if that chance came now?" The question hung in the air between them. She didn't speak. Her mind was trying to understand what he was suggesting, but she didn't want to assume anything. He continued. "I've spent years around people," he said. "Different industries, different talents. You learn to recognize when something is real." He glanced toward the piano for a second, then back at her. "What you did tonight wasn't just skill. It was something deeper." She shifted slightly, still unsure where this was going. "I can't ignore that," he added. There was a quiet sincerity in his voice that made it hard to dismiss. "What are you saying?" she asked softly. He met her gaze directly. "I'm saying I want to help you," he said. The words were simple, but they carried weight. She blinked slightly, caught off guard. "Help me?" she repeated. "Yes," he said. "If you're willing." Her first instinct was to step back, not physically but mentally. Offers like this didn't come without complications. Life had taught her to be careful. "I don't understand," she said. "I'm not offering something complicated," he replied. "I'm offering support. Lessons, training, whatever you need to rebuild what you had." She stared at him for a moment, trying to process everything. "Why?" she asked. It wasn't a suspicious question. It was a genuine one. He didn't answer immediately. "Because I've seen too many people regret walking away from something they were meant to do," he said finally. "And tonight, I saw someone who shouldn't have had to walk away in the first place." Her chest tightened slightly at those words. "It wasn't a choice," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. "That's exactly why this matters." She looked down, her thoughts moving quickly now. This wasn't something she had planned for. This wasn't something she had even hoped for anymore. And yet, here it was, right in front of her. "I have responsibilities," she said. "I can't just leave everything and start over." "I'm not asking you to leave everything," he said. "I'm asking if you're willing to try." There was a difference. A small one. but an important one. She stayed silent for a moment, thinking. The noise of the party continued in the background, but it felt distant now, like it belonged to another space entirely. "This isn't something I can decide quickly," she said. "I wouldn't expect you to," he replied. He reached into his pocket and took out a small card. "This has my contact," he said, holding it out to her. "Take your time. Think about it." She hesitated for just a second before accepting it. The card felt light in her hand, but it carried more weight than anything she had held that night. "If you decide to reach out," he continued, "we'll figure out the rest together." She looked at the card, then back at him. "And if I don't?" she asked. He gave a small, understanding nod. "Then at least you'll know you had the choice," he said. There was no pressure in his tone, no expectation, just an open door. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she nodded slightly. "Thank you," she said. He gave a small smile. "No," he replied. "Thank you. Tonight reminded me of something important too." She didn't ask what that was. She didn't need to. They both understood that something had changed. Not just for her, but for everyone who had been in that room. He stepped back then, giving her space. The conversation was over, but its impact remained. She stood there for a moment longer, the card still in her hand. Then she carefully placed it in her pocket. When she returned to the main floor, the party continued like before, but she moved through it differently now. Not because anyone else had changed, but because something inside her had. The piano still stood in the center of the room, quiet once again. But it no longer felt distant. It no longer felt like something from another life. Felt closer now. Possible. As the night slowly came to an end and guests began to leave, she continued her work until everything was done. No one rushed her. No one treated her the same way they had at the beginning of the night. There was a quiet respect that followed her movements now. When it was finally time to leave, she stepped outside into the cool night air. The noise of the party faded behind her. She took a slow breath, letting the silence settle around her. Her hand moved to her pocket, lightly touching the card. She didn't take it out. Not yet, but she knew it was there. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to think about something she had stopped believing in. Not success, not recognition, but possibility. She looked up for a moment, then began walking forward. This time, not just toward another shift, but toward something she hadn't fully decided yet. Something uncertain, but real. And for now, that was enough.